dropped something, but I don't know what it was. We're going to be continuing where Robbie left off. If you would turn to 1 Samuel chapter 15. And I had the same problem that Robbie did, and that is trying to figure out where to start and stop in this story, because once you jump into the middle of it, it just gets rolling. And this is one of the challenges of these lessons from the Old Testament. The stories are great. Sometimes they go on for several chapters. And so I appreciate Robbie kind of setting the backdrop of this and preparing us for where we're going to pick up. As we saw in the reading that we had, God has decided that Saul is not going to be king. He's going to take the kingdom away from him and give it to someone else. And if we skip down to the very last verse of chapter 15, it says, Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, but Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. In verse 28 of chapter 15, Samuel had told him that the Lord has torn the kingdom away and will give it to a neighbor who is better than him. So it has been declared the kingdom is going to be taken away from Saul. It's going to be given to someone else who will be a better king. And at the end of the chapter, it seems like Saul's story is over. In fact, chapter 16 begins, the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul, since I've rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I'll send you to Jesse, the Bethlehemite, for I have provided myself a king among his sons. And you might kind of think, well, that must be the end of Saul's story then. We're going to turn the page on Saul. It's a new day. It's going to be a new king. But actually, if you recall, there's a big overlap. So Saul his story doesn't just end right there. There's going to be the whole thing of him, chasing David around. That goes on for quite a while. And so this overlap between Saul and David plays out over quite a few chapters before we finally get to the true end of Saul's story. And it's a very sad end for him and for his son Jonathan. That'll take us a little while to get there. But in the meantime, today we're going to meet David, and we're going to get to chapter 17, which is David and Goliath. And that's one of those, there's a handful of Bible stories that everybody in the world knows, whether you know anything about the Bible or not. And I would suspect that David and Goliath would make that short list. If you could pick probably 10 things, 10 characters or 10 stories from the Bible that somebody would have to name that they've heard of or familiar with, it just comes up all the time. We've been watching a series on racing, and I don't know why we don't really care about racing, but it's just kind of interesting. And but yet last night, as we started that episode, they said this is a David and Goliath. And it caught my eye. It just comes up all the time when you have a small, outnumbered, undersized, underfunded kind of opponent facing someone who seems to be much bigger and stronger with a lot more resources. This David and Goliath comparison often comes up. So we hear it all the time. Everybody's familiar with it. But it's still a lesson that we can take some important lessons from. And so that's really going to be the focus of our story today. And especially when we get into chapter 17, I'm just going to be doing a lot of reading of the text, because it's such a great account that it's kind of hard to know what to skip over and what to leave out. So I know that you'll enjoy it as well, because it's a very beloved story. But first, let's set the background. We got to meet David. We can't jump ahead. As we saw in verse 1, the Lord says to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul? That's kind of an interesting statement, because it seems like there's a time to accept God's judgment. God had declared his judgment, and Samuel grieved, and that was right, but he needed to accept it. God had already made his will known about that. He has provided for himself a new king. And I think that's interesting, because it reminds me of what Abraham said to his son, the Lord will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering when they were going up on the Mount Moriah. And now it says, God says here, I have provided for myself a king. And of course, we know that one of David's descendants would be a king that the Lord would provide for himself, who is also the lamb that the Lord would provide for himself, who is Jesus. And so we keep seeing foreshadows of Jesus throughout all of these studies, especially as we get into the life of David. So you know how the story goes. They go and they find Jesse, and Jesse starts to bring his sons before Samuel. Samuel's got his horn full of oil, and he's ready to anoint somebody. And he thinks when he sees the first one, this is him. So verse 6, he looked on Eliab, and he said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. You'll recall that Saul looked the part completely. He was head and shoulders taller than everybody else, good looking. He was like Prince Charming. You know, if you had to line everybody up and pick somebody to be the king, especially in those days, remember why the people said they wanted a king who will go before us into battle and would lead us? They're really looking for someone that they could put their faith in. They had someone, but the someone they had was God. They wanted something they could see, because in this time when faith was very rare, people only looked at what they could see, including Saul. He was that kind of person. And the Lord's reminding Samuel, you can't just trust your eyes. God sees more than we see. And that's still true today. And it's one of the reasons why we have to be very careful about making judgments. And that'll pop up again later in this story, because we can't see what God can see, which is what's inside somebody, unless they reveal it by their actions. And so we need to be careful about making judgments about people's hearts for that reason, and also because it's not our place. We're not the one that people have to answer to. So that's just some lessons that maybe we can think about from this. But God sees what people don't see. He sees what's on the inside. So verse 10, Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, and Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen these. Samuel said to Jesse, are all your sons here? And he said, oh, there remains yet the youngest, but behold, he's keeping the sheep. Samuel said to Jesse, send and get him. We will not sit down until he comes here. And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. That word ruddy there has something about the word red in its meaning. And it's like, it meant like a real healthy complexion. Rosy cheeks, you might think of as a more modern kind of description of that. And so he was very healthy, a good looking, but I guess the reason why he wasn't the obvious choice is simply because of his youth. He's a young person. Now, it doesn't mean that he's a little boy at this point. We'll see a few verses later from now. I think it's clear that he's a young man. Probably it would be best described as a young adult. He's not like a little kid. And I'll show you why I'm saying that as we go through as we go on. But he is the youngest of the sons, and he's still considered a youth. So verse 13, Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. The Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward, and Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. Now, it's not clear that anybody there, including David, understood the significance of this anointing. We're not told that they were told that he's going to be king, or that he is now the king in waiting. It's just that Samuel came and asked them to come, and he anointed David in front of his brothers. And then really, Samuel just goes away. And I don't know if anybody, Jesse or the brothers, understood completely what was happening yet. And I'm not even sure what all David understood about that at this point, unless I've missed something. So we see the Spirit of the Lord is with David. On the other hand, that by contrast, verse 14 says the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul and is replaced with a harmful spirit. So Saul would be tormented at times by this harmful spirit. I suspect that you could think of that as a punishment for his rebellion. And in the Hebrews 12 way, we could probably think of it as a discipline from God. He had been rejected by God. He had been choosing the wrong things. And now he's suffering as a result of his choices, even suffering mentally. And we understand from the New Testament that the purpose of that kind of discipline is to bring about repentance. And so I would hope that the Lord has given Saul an opportunity to realize the longer he goes rejecting God, the worse it's going to get for him. And that's something that he should take to heart and humble himself and repent. Sadly, we don't see it have that effect. But his servants suggest to him while he was having these bouts of this harmful spirit that what he needed was some music and they sought out a person who was skilled. Now, notice how in verse 17, Saul said to his servants, well, provide me a man who can play well and bring him to me. One of the young men answered, this is verse 18, behold, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, a man of good presence, and the Lord is with him. Now, granted, this could have been a little while later from when Samuel anointed him. So it's possible he's grown a year or two. I don't know how long the time lapse is there. But this is still before he faces Goliath in the next chapter, when he's considered a young person. So in chapter 17, he's still considered, a youth. But he's obviously old enough that he had already distinguished himself as being valiant and brave. So that's what makes me think he's not like 12, but he's probably a young man, a young adult. Now, who knows, 18, 19, something like that. Still young, not like, full grown adult kind of person, and yet also not like a little kid. So somewhere between there is the age range that we're thinking about here, based on this description of David from this man who had some experience, who had met him. It's kind of just gives you a little hint that David had already kind of made a name for himself. It doesn't surprise us. When you think about what you know about David already, he was probably a standout, even as a young man, even as a teenager. He stood out, and people took note of him, as this guy did. All right, so verse 21 says, David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, let David remain in my service, for he's found favor in my sight. One of the smartest things that Saul ever did, I'm sure. Now, in the next chapters, we'll see it's obvious that David goes back and forth between watching the sheep and being around Saul. So it's not like now he moves into the palace and he's never a shepherd again, because when we meet him the next time, he's back home watching the sheep. And it seems obvious that he kind of alternates between serving Saul as needed, perhaps whenever this harmful spirit would come over Saul, and watching his father's sheep. The chronology of this account is a little bit tough to work out, but trying to piece it together, that's the best I've come up with. All right. So now we get to finally chapter 17, where we're going to meet the foe of our story, Goliath. So as chapter 17 opens, the Israelites and the Philistines have drawn up for battle. And this is the old style of battle that lasted really all the way up until about the Civil War, where one side lines up over here and one side lines up over there, and then they come together and fight. That obviously isn't the way it's done today, but that style of battle really was the way it was done for a lot of the world's history, and that's what's happened. So verse 3 says, the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, Israel stood on the mountain on the other, with a valley between them. And verse 4 says, there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. You might remember that there had been giants in the land. We had a whole lesson on that back during the time when Joshua was taking the land. It's one of the things that back when Joshua was a young man and was a spy that frightened everybody. They're like, we're like grasshoppers next to these people. Remember, some of the spies said that. And Joshua and Caleb weren't afraid. And even Caleb took on one of the hills where some of those giants, in fact, one of their leaders was known to live. And so there were some descendants of those people. And I suspect, although I don't know that we could prove it, that Goliath was descended from some of those, so that family of like really, really unusually tall people. Now, exactly how tall he was is not it's super clear. If you just take the 6 cubits and a span, each cubit's 18 inches and a span's like your hand, like this, I think. And so you end up with a little over 9 feet if you use that. In reading some of the translator notes, there's apparently some other manuscripts that have different, anytime you have numbers in the Bible, like distances, ages, that kind of stuff, sometimes you get some variation. So really the range is somewhere between, from what I could read, the estimates of what this would mean, somewhere between around 7 feet to around 9 feet. But I also read that the typical Israelite in those days was about 5 feet, 3 inches tall. I don't know how they know any of that. I guess anthropologists or somebody that studies, digging up bones and stuff. But people, generally get taller, or at least they have been lately. And a long time ago, it would have been, your average male, a little over 5 feet. So you can imagine even being like a Hulk Hogan sized person, like almost 7 feet. If you were thinking about the type of battle they did, which was hand-to-hand combat, imagine the advantage you would have if you were 2 feet taller. And not only, he wasn't just some lanky 2 feet taller, because it describes his armor, which is estimated to weigh about 200 pounds. Verse 5 says he had a helmet of bronze. He was on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had bronze armor on his legs, a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. His spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. His shield bearer went before him. All of this is basically to say, not only is he taller than everybody else, but he's super strong too, because he's carrying some very, very heavy armor on him. So he's not like just, some tall, lanky, skinny person, but he's like, unusually strong as well, and on top of being big. So imagine if you were fighting something like that and the weapons were a spear or a sword. I mean, a 5'3" average sized person is just not going to have any chance really at all. And they knew that. And if you don't take faith into account, if you just look at it as just on the human level, this guy would easily beat anybody on Israel's side. At least that's how they felt about it. So verse 8, he stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves. Let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." Now, if everybody on the Israel side looks around to figure out, should somebody go, who would be the one person that would be the first you would think should face him? If only they had somebody who was significantly taller than everybody else on their side. Well, they do, right? And if only they had picked this person to lead them in the battle. That's King Saul. See, he's head and shoulders taller than everybody else. And so, if you kind of look around, there's one of us who's the biggest, and he is the king. And after all, they had said, we need a king who will lead us in battle and go before us. And that's who they got. But that's not who they got, because he only looked the part. But inside, he was small, remember? And so he was not ever going to be brave, and he's not going to be brave here in this account either. So we're told in verse 11 that when Saul and all Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they, including Saul, were dismayed and greatly afraid. So really just another example of Saul's, I don't know if cowardice is too strong of a word, but just he was never brave. He was always afraid, I think. He was afraid of what the people thought. He was afraid of but everything he saw, he looked at through our earthly eyes. So it's time for a new leader to step on the scene. Of course, that's what we've been prepared for. So verse 12, we're reminded of David. David, the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years, talking about Jesse. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle. The names of the 3 oldest who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days, the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. So every morning, every night, he comes out and he challenges them. Sounds like neither side really wanted to fight too bad, and they were happy to let it be settled by this duel between Goliath and somebody, if they would ever pick somebody to come out. So, verse 17, Jesse says to David, "Take for your brothers an ephah of parched grain, 10 loaves, carry them quickly to the camp. Also take 10 cheeses to the commander of the thousands. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them." So Jesse, who's an old man, as we've already seen, is back at home. He's wondering how things are going. interesting there. I was wondering, I didn't think to check, but that's the first reference to cheese. Cheese goes way back, but and also there's something treasured by them. He's like, hey, take this to the commander. This is something good. Bring them some cheese. Anyway, that's not important. Just an interesting little detail. So, verse 20, David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper, took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. And when he came to the encampment, as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry, it's kind of funny. They all go out getting themselves all fired up for battle, and then they're going to stand there and listen to Goliath and not do anything. So David left the things in the charge of the keeper of the baggage, ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked to them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. So he thinks we're about to have a battle. He hears the people were going out to war, and so he runs over there, and then everybody just stands on the hill while Goliath's down there. Send me a man, and David's listening to him. Verse 25, the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who's come up? Surely he has come to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Nobody else is thinking about the living God, of course. Only David has in his mind that, look, we have the living God on our side. The people answered him in the same way. In other words, they said what had been said about what Saul would do. So shall it be done to the man who kills him. You can tell that David's he can't believe it, what he's hearing. Now, verse 28 says that Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and his anger was kindled against David. And he said, why have you come down? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. So he's really trying to put David down, making fun of his job as the shepherd. All he's good for is taking care of a handful of sheep somewhere. And, what are you doing here? And he makes the worst kinds of judgments about David's intentions. This goes back to the thing we saw earlier where God looks on the heart. And Eliab is making a judgment here about David's heart and saying that David, he said, I know that your presumption and the evil of your heart, you've only come to see the battle. In other words, you're just here to watch some carnage. You're not here for any good purpose. You're just, and maybe he's even angry that David is trying to stir up the men to go face this challenge and basically saying, all you want to do is see somebody get slaughtered or whatever. But he's assuming the worst about David and the worst about David's intentions. And it's really a warning to us to be careful that we don't ever do that. We don't want to assume the worst about people or the worst about each other. And it's probably motivated, wouldn't you think, by some guilt on Eliab's part that he is also not going down to face the giant. David's, by asking his questions, is kind of challenging all the men there. Why are we letting this guy say all that? Why aren't we facing him? And Eliab, who's the oldest brother, I think he kind of was pricked a little bit by David's words. So he lashes out in anger at David and tries to just insult him and put him in his place. That doesn't stop David from continuing to talk about it. He's not worried about what Eliab says. So verse 31, when the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Saul said to David, you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war since his youth. Basically, he's been a warrior since before David was born. It's kind of, I think, the meaning there. Of course, how is Saul sizing up the matter? The only way he knows how. He's looking at David. He's looking at Goliath. That's all he's thinking about, because he doesn't have faith to guide him. So verse 34, David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him, delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. Do you see Jesus in there, buddy? Don't you see Jesus already? I think there's so many things. You know, David's a man after God's own heart, and Jesus is going to be the son of David, and he's going to rule on the throne. Jesus is the good shepherd. We are the flock. Jesus has defeated, Satan roars about like a roaring lion. I mean, there's so many things here that I think are interesting. If you kind of keep Jesus in mind as you read all of this, and you see kind of foreshadows and things of Jesus in David. So David said in verse 37, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion, the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, the Lord be with you. You would think that David's speech would have stirred up some courage in Saul's heart, and maybe even ashamed him to the point where he realized, you know what, David, you're right. God is on our side. I'll go face this. Wouldn't that have been a great turn of the story? If Saul, listening to David talk about his faith in God, had summoned up his courage and started suiting up for battle and gone. I mean, wow, what a twist. What a wonderful thing that would have been for Saul to kind of find some faith and courage in this. But he doesn't. He said, okay. And he starts putting he's, of course, the biggest one of all of them, Saul. He's putting his armor on the young man, David, which just shows that Saul really wasn't going to figure it out in terms of his faith business. So verse 38, Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped his sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested him. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off, and he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. So we've already had the description of the Philistine's armor. It went through in detail all the things that he had on, all the 200 pounds worth of armor. David, for a minute, was suited up, but then he took all that off, and now he's got a staff, he's got a sling, and he's picked up 5 stones. And now he's going off to face the giant. So verse 41, the Philistine moved forward and came near David with his shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. The Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? The Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Now, David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and a spear, with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with the sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. Now, for whose benefit is he saying all that? Partly to respond to Goliath, but I'm sure he's saying it in a way that everybody on his side can hear what he's saying. Just think about this. I'm covered in goosebumps reading it. What an awesome, this is the kind of leader that people would want, right? This is the kind of person who's going to inspire, not that they're strong and they're better, but to remind them that really it's all about putting your faith in God, and that the victory is going to come through God and his power. It doesn't matter if Goliath is stronger and better armed and David is basically unarmed. It's the Lord who will give the victory. Just an awesome, one of the best battle cries of all time, for sure. So verse 48, the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, and David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. What an awesome picture. Just imagining him. He's sprinting he's running quickly toward Goliath as he goes. And David put his hand in his bag and took a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell on his face to the ground. Now, the fact that you could kill something with a sling and a stone is actually not miraculous. You can find people in the Middle East today still, in fact, shepherd type people, use slings, and they use them in battle too. And you can sometimes see in pictures of the Palestinian people with Israel, because they're just like, very, 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 very poor. Israel's got like tanks. But sometimes those boys will take something in a sling and you can throw something hard enough to kill somebody, but it has to hit them just right. And I think that's where the hand of God is coming into this. Saul is well armed, and David is running, and he's got this sling, and that stone hits exactly where it needs to hit to send Goliath down onto his face. So obviously, God is working through this to give David the victory. So verse 50 says, David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him, and there was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and drew his sword, took his sword, and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. At this, the men of Israel shout, and suddenly they're courageous, and they run after the Philistines, and they strike them all the way to Gath and the gates of Ekron. Verse 54, David took the head of the Philistine, brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. So David's going to hang on to some of those things, the spoils of this victory. Now, as Saul's watching all this, he says, whose son is David? And that's another little bit of the strange thing here, because you would think he already knows whose son David is from previous conversations, but perhaps he's never really paid too much attention to David, and now he's really wondering, like, who is this? That's kind of what I think. He's like, he's met David, and he knows David's father's Jesse, but I think now suddenly watching all of this, he's like, who is this? Who is this guy? Like, who is his family? And so, verse 57, skipping down near the end, as soon as David returned from striking down the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. Can you believe that? I mean, he walks up he still carried Goliath's head around. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. And we'll stop there for today. The true king is rising. Saul's days are numbered. He's still technically king, but it's obvious now that there's a new leader, and there's someone who has faith in God and who is courageous. So let's think about 3 lessons from this, things that we can apply to ourselves. One of them that we already talked about is that God looks on the heart, and that's, of course, important to remember. We can fool each other. We can put on a show externally, but we can never fool God, and he sees right through us, and he sees exactly what our intentions and good or bad, what our our thoughts and all that. So he can discern the thoughts and intentions of our heart, and he's the one that we have to answer to, not anybody else. So it doesn't matter whether I can fool all of you and you can fool me. We can't fool God. He sees who we truly are. Another lesson is that tests often come when we're alone. I couldn't figure out the best way to word this, but what I'm talking about is, it's interesting how when David decides to face Goliath, and he goes to Saul and he says, don't let, in nobody's hearts be troubled. I will go. And Saul's like, you can't, you're just a youth. He said, no, but, and he tells him about some times when he was out watching the sheep and a lion or a bear came, and he went after them and struck down got the sheep back from them. And if they turned on him, then he struck them down. And so when you realize that, and you realize what the Lord had said to Samuel, however long before this, I have prepared for myself a king, right? Remember the Lord said that to Samuel back in chapter 50, before we even meet David. But guess who already knew David? Of course, God did. And so as David's a young man and he's out there all alone watching some sheep, he was faced with some tests, as these wild animals would come. And that built up his courage as he was able to overcome them. And he was able to defend the sheep, which of course shows us the character of a good shepherd, that he cares for the sheep. Remember, Jesus talks about this in John 10. And he says a hireling will just run away, but the good shepherd will basically put himself, in danger to protect the sheep, which of course Jesus does for us. But the point here is that David was, I think, really kind of groomed and tested and prepared so that when the moment came to face Goliath, he had that confidence because he had already been tested. And when you think about Jesus, the son of David, later, remember that when he was about to begin his earthly ministry, what was the first thing that he did? Well, he was baptized, and then immediately he was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tested. And Satan came and tempted him and tested him. And it was after that period of trial that he, went on his way doing his ministry. And then in the pattern that we see for like deacons, the Lord says in his instructions, let them be tested first and then let them, So it seems like there's a pattern here that you face small tests, you face small challenges. And when you're faithful in something small, you're given something bigger, some bigger responsibility. And I think that's the way that we are groomed as well, to be servants, that you may face some trial, you may face some temptation or some test. It may be that nobody's around, like David out there in the wilderness with those sheep, and who would even know what happened? But he chose faith in God, and he was courageous, and that all prepared him for this bigger moment to step out in front of the army of Israel and face the giant. And so I think there's a lesson in that about how God prepares us and develops us, and tests are usually going to be part of that. The second lesson is from David's statement about, I can't wear this armor. Remember that Saul had put all this stuff on him, and David said, I can't, I haven't tested it. Like he was going to wear it, but I think he just meant he's not used to that. It's not something that he had ever practiced with. He's got this stuff on, and he can't fight like that because he's not used to it. Well, what about us in our spiritual battle? If you were to go to Ephesians 6, we see that there's a whole armor of God. It's a helmet and a breastplate and a belt and a sword. And what if when the battle comes, we've never practiced with the armor? What if we're trying to put it on for the first time when we face a test and we've never studied and we've never put the work in? And now suddenly we're facing some huge challenge. We're going to be a lot like David in putting some armor on that feels very foreign to us and we're not used to it. So the challenge for us is to be as good with our spiritual armor as David is with that sling. And he's probably spent a lot of time practicing with that sling. He was confident and comfortable with it. And we need to be confident and comfortable with the armor that the Lord has given us. And then when the day of the battle comes, it won't feel strange, or it won't be unusual or something that we're not familiar with. And then finally, of course, the David's rallying cry could really stir all of us up, that we're going to face challenges. We're going to face things that are frightening, but we can remember that the battle belongs to the Lord. In Romans 8, Paul says, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. In all these things, no matter what we face, we are already victorious through our faith in Jesus. The same confidence that David had, that the battle belongs to the Lord and God is going to be victorious, we can share in that. We're in the same boat as David. We face a foe, we face enemies, we face things that are threatening and scary, but we don't have to be afraid. We can run headlong into the conflict, knowing that if we have put our faith in God, he's going to be victorious on his side. And if we put our faith and trust in God, then we can't lose. That's what David understood. He was one of the very few people in all of Israel, including Saul, who actually could see it, because all they could think about was what they could see with their eyes. But through faith, we understand there's someone way more powerful than we are, and there's much more things going on, and that the side that God is on is always going to be victorious. So that's the lessons I'll leave you with this morning from this awesome story. If there's some way that's just stirred up in you, the desire to repent or make things right or put your faith in God, and if we can be of any assistance, we would certainly be glad to. If you'll let us know while we stand and sing.